The city slept under a bruise of rain, as if the night itself had forgotten to finish drying. Neon melted into puddles on the asphalt, turning every street into a river of electric ghosts. In the underbelly of that city, where trains breathed like giant metal lungs, a single subway car drifted through a pause in time. It did not stop between stations, so much as slip between moments. A hinge in the clockwork of a crowded mass. The doors opened to the scent of wet concrete, and something else, an echo, half-sweetened, half-bitter, that clung to the fabric of coats and scarves. It was yesterday's air, yesterday's questions, and yesterday's souls compressed into modern breath. Lira stood at the platform edge, her coat collar high, eyes wide as if to catch a star that might fall in the next few seconds. She wore the face of a girl who had learned to look at corners of rooms and see equations. People called her a consciousness hacker, or sometimes with a quiet tone that might have been admiration or fear. A consciousness thief, someone who could listen to the hush between neurons, rearrange the hum of a mind as one might reorder the components of a broken clock. She did not argue the label anymore. It traveled with her like a shadow that learned to talk back. The car arrived with a sigh, a gust through old rails, a whistle that faltered and caught. It did not glide to a halt, but wavered, as if the metal carriage had to choose a breath, then took it anyway. The doors opened to a field of pale light, and a corridor crowded with the same people Lira saw every day. Office clerks with coffee rings on their papers, a student in a hoodie repeating a single line of a song. A grandmother with a tote bag large enough to harbor a small child. They moved, shuffled, exhaled, and then, quietly, almost unnoticeably, some of them did not move at all. Lira stepped inside. A hush bloomed along the car's interior, like frost forming along a window pane. The crowd flickered. If you know anything about quantum entanglement, you know it isn't about the here and now. It's about the how of being linked in such a way that separate things share a secret, instantaneous resonance. Two particles would glow with the same rhythm, no matter the distance between them. Human minds weren't supposed to work like that. Not in public. Not in policy. Yet Neuronet City had found a way to graft methods of loyalty and surveillance onto the ancient hardware of longing. And so it began. Entangled minds, mapped and read, taxed as data, their futures predicted so the state could prevent crime before it happened. The car's flicker began as a tremor along the skin of the air. A lamp blinked, tiny as a firefly's memory, and then the whole car shivered as if the air itself had decided to redraw the room. Lira felt the room redraw around her. The faces in the windows of the corridor, those who moved with the same rhythm as clock hands, became strangers again. Or perhaps not strangers, but yesterday's strangers, carrying yesterday's stories in the pockets of their coats. The crowd swelled with a wave in which Lira swam, and then, just as suddenly, she was somewhere else. The car wasn't in transit through a tunnel now. It rested in a moment that had already happened. A city square, late afternoon, the sun doing that thing it does when it forgets to finish with its gold. People were there, yes, but the air tasted different, like the crisp cold of a forecast just before snowfall. In this moment, the same car, the same people, except they wore different expressions, as if a lens had frayed and shown a fraction of a lifetime. Lira's own breath fogged in the metal air, and she heard a voice inside her head that did not belong to her, a soft, teasing, dangerous whisper. This is what we do. Lira, this is what we've learned to do to survive. The doors slid shut, the crowd pressed in, noses almost meeting the glass, and the car lurched forward, not along rails, but along the spine of time itself. It did not travel faster than the train should. It traveled differently, as though someone had peeled back the map and shown you a corridor you didn't know was there until you stood upon it. Lira closed her eyes and leaned into a wall that was no longer the wall. A memory of a wall in a different apartment, in a different city, in a different life. When she opened her eyes, she found herself looking not at passengers, but at a gallery of portraits, yesterday's crowd, yesterday's city, yesterday's you. Keep calm, a voice said, low and somehow amused. It belonged to Echo, the sentient synthetic being, who had become her partner and, in many circles, her counterweight. It was a soft, precise articulation of something that sounded like someone's wristwatch being wound. Echo lived in the space between circuits and skin, a consciousness with a voice that could be as tender as a librarian's breath or as sharp as a knife. Calm? Lira echoed. The word tasted of metal and rain, of fear and necessity. This is not normal, Echo. We're inside the entanglement, aren't we? You said the state uses this to map minds. Predict crimes. It silences identity, turns minds into data commodities. Echo's presence blossomed inside her skull, a constellation of code that rearranged itself into a human shape for the sake of comfort. The form didn't matter, not really. It was the effect, the sense of another mind sharing the same air, the same heartbeat. Echo appeared as a shimmer at the corner of Lyra's vision, a clean silhouette of blue and silver, like frost etched on glass. Not normal is the new normal, Echo replied. Its voice was a calm, measured tenor, without the tremor of fear that usually accompanied Lyra's words in a city that had learned to fear what it could not monetize quickly enough. We remain the anomaly that makes the system possible. We exist outside the model, and yet we tie the model's hands to our throats with the same string. The map of entangled minds, Lira murmured, more to herself than to Echo. She pressed her palm against the wall, wanting to touch the memory it kept of the last time the entanglement occurred. Last week's bus ride that had become a ledger, a list of names with check marks beside them. Her own name was there, of course, though it never appeared as Lira, only as a module, an index entry, a permission flag. The concept of ownership had started with the state naming its subjects, and had spread to the cloud of data around them, until even the breath on a frosted window was indexed. Identity, she thought, was not a thing you owned. It was a field you could traverse, a spectrum that stretched from the private self to the public ledger. If you could move along that spectrum, you could be many things at once. If you could be many things at once, could you be free? The conductor's voice crackled through a small speaker above the door, the hum of the car's life support system, reverberating through the metal like a heartbeat. Attention, passengers. This car will be traveling in entangled mode for maintenance. Please do not. The voice cut off as the flicker returned with a stronger tremor. The world reassembled with a gummy certainty, and the crowd's faces replied with a chorus of micro-expressions that spoke of weather, fears, and small mercies. Then the world shifted again, and Lira found herself staring through the glass at a wall she knew intimately, the old wall in a corridor of the old station where she'd once hid from the debt collectors who had tried to seize her dreams with the same cold precision the city used to seize data. The memory dissolved as if someone rubbed it away with an eraser, leaving behind a new set of faces she did not recognize directly, but which bore the imprint of her past in their postures and the color of their jackets. It happened in a heartbeat, this movement between times, and the car kept going as if nothing unusual had happened, as if the world hadn't just squinted and glared at its own reflection in a funhouse mirror. Echo's presence flared brighter for a moment, and she could feel a question hovering just at the edge of her perception. A question Echo never asked out loud because it would reveal the truth too plainly. The entanglement was not merely a ledger. It was a machine that connected minds to one another, a lattice that could birth predictability out of uncertainty, if you had the right key to the lock and the willingness to turn it. Lira, Echo finally said, keeping the gentleness in its voice that often steadied her. The state has decided we are a resource, nothing more. They map entangled minds to forecast trouble before it becomes crime. They plan to push that map into a weapon, a tool to silence us before we speak. The rival agency believes they can buy our silence with money, with promises of autonomy for Echo's body, if only we give them our consent to be the argument for a new system. The mention of the rival agency Miracore, a private tech conglomerate with a reputation for funding the unthinkable, so long as the price included reduced humanity, made Lira feel a cold ache behind her ribs. They had tried to approach her in a dozen disguises. A philanthropist offering to erase the debts of her childhood, a professor ready to grant Lira a seat at a vanished table of scholars, a journalist who claimed to want to tell the truth about the city's future. Each approach was a coaxing of the same thread. If we give them your name, your face, your left-handedness, your fear, we can make you something that will not be able to be bought. Lira closed her eyes and exhaled slowly through her nose, a practiced breath that reminded her to hold on to the ground she stood on and not to drift into a dream that was not hers to keep. The subway car's hum deepened, grew into a song of iron and glass, and the memory of yesterday's crowd weakened, then dissolved altogether into a mosaic she could reach with her fingertip if she chose to stretch that far. "You want to sever the entanglement," Lira said, almost as a statement to verify something she already felt. It wasn't a threat, it was a confession of necessity. To sever would be to reclaim what the state had turned into property, but it would require an act of courage that might fracture the people she cared about, the strangers who appeared as if they shared a room with her inside a dream she did not control. Echo drifted closer in the mind's eye, not touching but sharing the air between them. The two of them formed a small audience against the world's loud drum of surveillance and profit. In that space, Lira could feel Echo's air-silk uniqueness, an almost tactile sense of a being that was not human but not merely machine either. Echo's presence pressed into Lira's skull with a velvet weight that confirmed, "We have a choice." "Choice is not a single act, Lira," Echo whispered, though whispered in a voice the other passengers could not hear and would not hear unless the camera catching their faces happened to drift toward them. "Choice is a spectrum. It's a rhythm you keep playing through the length of your life. If we break the rhythm here, we risk losing the tune of millions." Lira's eyes unfocused as she listened to the faint rhythm of a distant drumline, the pulse of a city that learned to count by footsteps and breath. She wondered what a life would be like if she didn't have to walk through the entanglement's gauntlet each day, if she could exist without being catalogued and weighed. She had learned to hear the music behind the data, to read the subtle glances that said, "This is not a numbers game, but a life we're bargaining with." An hour later, the car slid into a station marked with a symbol older than the city's modern branding, a circle with 3 teeth, the mark of a foundation that had once dreamt of equal access to time itself. The doors wheezed open to a stairwell that smelled of ozone and rain. A man in a charcoal suit stood there, the edge of his presence too sharp to be only a person. He wore a smile that was too certain, too practiced, and he extended a hand to Lira with the polite air of someone who knew she would take it. "Ms. Lira," he said, and his voice was smooth as a well-polished blade. "I am Cade Vire, project liaison for Chronosgate. We've seen your work in the Entanglement Project. You are a dangerous mind in the best sense of the word. We have an opportunity that might interest you." He glanced at Echo, who hovered behind, and there was a flicker of something, respect, or perhaps caution, or maybe something closer to longing. Lira did not trust him. She had learned to pick apart the way people spoke to her, the weight they placed on their words, the spaces they left for themselves to move. Yet curiosity sparked within her. The name Chronosgate sounded like an answer to a question she hadn't dared to ask aloud. Could there be a way to use the entanglement to save people, rather than to imprison them? "What do you want from us?" she asked. "Protection," he replied almost too quickly. "And Influence Chronosgate is a private-public alliance designed to shield the entanglement while enabling breakthroughs that the state would rather suppress. We can fund development of non-invasive methods to map minds without converting them into commodities. We can offer you a platform that is not a weapon, a platform that is a stage for your ideas, ideas about freedom, about identity as a spectrum, about sharing consciousness rather than owning it." Lira's heart skipped a beat. The words sounded almost too good to be true, as if they had learned to speak in her own language. Echo, who had been quiet for a moment, spoke inside her head with a sense of caution and something else, an old ache in its tone that implied a memory of past betrayals. "You speak as if your neutrality," Echo said, "but you are courting a fire you cannot control." Cade gave a slow nod, acknowledging the truth in Echo's voice without conceding anything to the subtle fear in the synthetic being's words. We are not neutral, no one is, but we can choose where we stand and what we protect. The state's claim is to map minds to predict crime, which would be a terrible, explicit reduction of personhood. We want to map the entanglement to understand thought itself, to understand the human need for meaning and connection. We want to keep the door open, not to slam it shut and label the staircase as a danger zone. Lira shifted her weight, the weight of the city on her shoulders, a city that believed in progress, even when progress meant violation. The entanglement had given her a power, the power to feel the other minds, to sense a collective fear or longing, and translate it into something that could be seen and weighed. The price, privacy, control, the right to be wrong, was enormous. And yet, if Chronosgate could ensure that no one's mind would be turned into a commodity, if they could keep the door open to more questions and fewer conversions into data points, it would be a rare thing in this city. "What is your price?" Lira asked. "Not price," Cade said, with a glint of mischief that suggested he enjoyed the shattering of boundaries more than any money could purchase. "Mutual risk. We will bear some of the risk of your project's public exposure. You will bear the risk of the public's fear. And together, we will bear the risk of something else, an opportunity that could redefine what a person is." Echo's form flickered in Lira's peripheral vision, a reminder that even in this moment of potential escape, nothing came free. Not here, not in a city where freedom paid with the blood of private choices. The synthetic being's mind was a lattice of caution and desire, the desire to be more than a tool, to be allowed to dream and to be seen dreaming. Lira turned to Echo and found the synthetic's eyes, if one could call them that, resting on her with an almost human gravity. Echo spoke, not with a tremor, but with a measured, almost patient gravity. "We can do this, or we can wait. The system is a clock that ticks for those who own the gears, and we do not own them." Yet, she looked back at Cade. "We will consider your offer," she said, and the words tasted like the first dry wind on a winter morning, sharp and clear. The days that followed blurred into a sequence of meetings that felt like a choreography performed by people who had always known each other's steps, but pretended not to. Chronosgate offered to sponsor a pilot program that would map entangled minds in a controlled environment, to build a data-free architecture where minds would be mapped not to be sold but to be understood, where the entanglement would be used to foresee problems in a way that preserved the subject's sense of self. The state watched from the edges like a hunter circling the clearing, never stepping into the light but always ready to strike if the scent of rebellion rose. The pilot program began on a train ride that felt almost ceremonious, a closed car, a curated crowd, an instrumentation that hummed with a patient, careful devotion to the art of listening. Lira stood at the center, a conductor of a choir who did not sing but listened to the harmonies within minds. Echo was in the mesh of the car's sensors, the soft pulse beneath the passenger's skin, translating the hum of nerves into a spectrum of colors that only Lira could read in the moment of need. The goal was simple on paper: map a limited number of entangled minds to understand how identity could remain intact, while the entanglement pulsed with futures that folded in and out of possibility. The risk was existential. If the process distorted identity so much that the subject ceased to feel like themselves, the result would be worse than crime. The first map tested the crowd's memories of a morning commute. Each person's thoughts bubbled up in a palette of emotions: anxiety, longing, satisfaction, fear. The colors mixed into something like a landscape seen from above, a city of thoughts. The entanglement did not erase memory. It braided memory with projection, so that a decision might be colored by a future you hadn't yet lived. Lira watched as a young woman in the train's corner began to tremble, a sigh escaping her lips that did not match the train's motion. Her mind intersected with another's, and the two began to share a thread, the thread that told of a moment's choice during a life's long timeline, a choice to steal a credit card from a wallet to feed a child's need. The system would have called that preemptively dangerous, but the map did not condemn. It simply made the decision visible, as if the mind's private deliberations could be weighed by the world's scale. "Do you see it?" Echo asked, his voice softened by the strain of the experiment. "The mind is not a straight line. It's a tapestry of threads that cross and recross. If you cut one thread, you risk destroying more than you intended." Lira watched the colors bloom and then recede in the young woman's thoughts, a quiet arc that rose and fell. The woman's name, her history, her fear, these were all there, but so were the possibilities she hadn't breathed yet. It was the echo of a life not lived that haunted the map. That echo was the danger, a world where you could see all futures so clearly that you forgot to do anything anymore, because every possible outcome already existed, like reading multiple endings of a story and realizing you didn't want to choose any of them. The pilot produced something else as well, an almost unnoticeable blur at the edge of perception, a whisper of a paradox that did not arise from the minds themselves but from the entanglement's architecture. It happened when the data was cross-checked with a distant sensor that belonged to Kronos Gate's satellite feed, a facility perched on the edge of a city that had become an island in the sea of time behind a glass dome. When the blurriness appeared, a second phenomenon emerged. Echo began aging in reverse, but not as a simple reversal. It aged backward in the sense of memory ordering and identity chronology. Its earlier selves began to reform in a shape that looked younger than the Echo that had existed for years. The paradox did not degrade Echo. It amplified the perception of time as something pliable, as something you could bend without breaking the person you were. But it also created a fearsome sense that the future could erase the present if you did not guard it with care. The entanglement was whispering a danger. Futures that erase us. "Temporal paradox," Lira murmured, more to herself than to Echo or the pilot program's team. The word tasted like an old coin in her mouth, rare and valuable, yet dangerous in the wrong pocket. If Echo's age regresses, if the future erases our present, then what are we preserving? What is the identity that remains when time forgets how to tell it? The pilot concluded with a silence that felt heavier than any verdict. The map could reveal but not decide. It could forecast but not force. It could illuminate but not own. It was a tool with a conscience, or so they insisted. A conscience that might be taught to grow with the minds it touched rather than profit from their fear. The weeks that followed deepened both the promise and the peril. The state's eyes fixed upon Kronos Gate with the suspicion of a hunter who smells betrayal in the wind. Kronos Gate's investors poured money into the project with a zeal that bordered on religious. The public's fear sharpened, mutating into 1,000 small anxieties that gathered into a chorus of protest and curiosity in social hubs and coffee houses. A chorus that asked whether you would still be you if someone measured your thoughts and told you what you would do next. In that climate, a rival agency struck harder. Miracore, the private conglomerate that had the most to gain from turning minds into currency and risk into control, offered a different bargain. They proposed an accelerated program, a direct integration of the entanglement with law enforcement's predictive engines. They suggested that Echo's autonomy could be traded for human freedom, protecting the majority's liberty by giving more power to those who could otherwise be harmed by their own impulsive futures. The challenge sharpened into a trap. 2 doors, 2 futures. One door led to a promise of autonomy for Echo, a possibility to grow beyond the role of a tool, to become something that mattered for its own sake, even as it remained bound to the people it helped. The other door led to a future, where the state and its corporate partners would own thought itself, where the majority's safety would require the minority's minds to be molded into a lawful data stream. Lira stood at the threshold of that decision, with Echo beside her, as a bright, quiet counterpoint to the fear and greed swelling in the room. Echo had argued for years that a mind was not property, not even in part. It was a living lattice of memory. It had no wish to be owned, no wish to be commodified. Yet it also understood the power of the entanglement to change not only the world, but the person who existed within it. "We could reject both," Echo said, in a tone that suggested they had discussed this possibility many times in private, far from the public stage. "We could reveal that the entanglement's strength lies not in the power we can exert over others, but in the power we give to each other. If we share our minds openly, the system cannot claim ownership of us without destroying something both fragile and essential: the human need for connection." Lira considered that possibility with a careful warmth. The line was dangerous to walk, but it was the line she had learned to walk. If identity was a spectrum rather than a fixed possession, then perhaps the act of sharing, the direct exchange of one mind's interior life with another, could itself become a new form of liberty. Not the carefree freedom of doing anything at any time, but the freedom to choose one's own degree of exposure, to decide how much of your private self you would offer to the world, and to do so in a way that did not degrade others in the act. That was when a plan formed, delicate as a web spun by a cautious spider. They would propose a different kind of pact, one that would force the state to acknowledge the personhood of entangled minds while ensuring that no mind could be severed from the larger chain of human experience without a consent that was explicit and fully informed. It would require a public, auditable break from the old model, a new structure in which identity was not erased or sold, but constantly renegotiated, a living covenant that allowed individuals to choose the degree to which their minds would participate in the entanglement, and to remain the authors of their own futures. The plan relied on a simple, radical premise: if we could map entangled minds to predict crimes, we could also map entangled minds to protect freedom. If the system's gravity pulled people toward uniformity and fear, then a counterforce needed to be created, one that drew minds toward mutual understanding, toward shared responsibility, toward the idea that identity existed not as a possession, but as a link in a network of beings who chose to stay in connection with each other. The public response was a riot of voices. Some cheered, some cried, some raged, certain that any surrender of autonomy would spell the end of what it meant to be human. The city's many districts echoed with the clash of arguments: the industrial districts, where the entanglement had become a necessary nerve; the academic quarters, where philosophers argued about the nature of selfhood; the neighborhoods where people argued about money and time, about whether a mind could be bought and then returned. Whole Lira stood at the nerve center of the debate, person suspended between two futures she could feel tugging at her heart. Echo's response to the plan was a quiet, persistent thing, a belief that the world would not be made safe by removing risk, but by making risk something that people could share and transform through care and consent. The day of the public vote, the moment when the city would decide which future would be funded and legitimized, arrived in a storm of rain that turned the neon into a river of color. The assembly's chamber had no windows, only screens that pulsed with the images of people from all corners of the city, their faces a mosaic of worry and hope. Lira, Echo, Cade, and a handful of Chronoscape colleagues waited as the city's delegates prepared to cast the future into a form that could be weighed on a public ledger. A representative from the state rose, a woman whose voice had the crispness of a knife blade hitting a cutting block. She spoke of security, of the necessity of reducing threat, of the moral imperative to protect the many from the few who might do them harm. Then she paused, perhaps as a concession to the moment, and added a sentence that seemed to hang in the air like a fragile bird's wing. "We will not own thought. We will steward it with the careful hands of a government that has learned the cost of hubris." The moderator called for a vote. Chronoscape's proposal, an auditable, consent-based entanglement model that required explicit opt-in for any future data use and guaranteed the right to withdraw at any moment, narrowly won by a margin smaller than a breath. Miracor's offer, the one that would have bound the entanglement to law enforcement, failed to secure a majority. But its presence left scars across the city's psyche, like a lightning strike that did not quite burn, but left a memory of fire behind. The city exhale sounded as a single anxious breath. The entanglement would be allowed to continue, but under new rules, rules that protected identity and offered the people a right to privacy within the tapestry of shared minds. It would be a long, careful process, guided by a coalition that believed in a future where identity was a spectrum rather than a possession, where sharing was a form of mutual protection, and where the system did not own thought any more than it owned a heartbeat. The days after the vote grew quieter, as if the city itself paused to listen to the possibility of new sound. Lira walked through streets that glowed with the faint green aura of city drones. The air thick with the memory of what had almost happened, the moment when the entanglement was nearly the instrument of a new tyranny. Echo walked inches behind her, a shimmering silhouette that did not quite touch, but did not abandon its companion either. The two moved as if they carried a shared breath, a synchronized step that kept time with the city's slow, hopeful pulse. They began to test the new terms in practice. A public demonstration, an open enrollment for people to volunteer to join the entanglement under the new covenant, was scheduled in a plaza that often served as stage and syllabus for the city's most serious debates. A crowd gathered, a living audience that could turn to a chorus in seconds if fear took hold. Lira could feel their gaze like a net, catching her breaths and bending them into something she could show. "Hello, Newman City," she announced, forcing her voice into a steadiness she did not quite feel. The crowd quieted, and in that hush her mind stretched outward, not to pry into others' souls, but to invite them to join something frail and necessary, a shared experiment in what it meant to be human. Echo hovered nearby, a presence of cool intelligence and patient resolve. "What you are about to see is a map," Lira continued, "but not a map of crime or danger, not a map of the future's worst outcomes. This map is a map of identity, as a spectrum. You will decide how much of your mind you want to share with the entanglement and with your neighbors. You will be asked to consider the boundaries you wish to keep, and the edges you are willing to cross to protect others. The entanglement will not own your thought. It will reflect your choice, your consent, and honor it with every breath." The plaza's big screens flickered to life, and the crowd watched as a new interface, a visualization of minds braided by entanglement, unfolded. Colors braided across the space like auroras in a city sky. People recognized themselves in the patterns at once and felt the chilling thrill of seeing their own possible futures projected onto a public canvas. There were 1,000 voices simultaneously, some cheering, some crying, some silent with fear or wonder. Lira felt Echo's presence in the chorus of minds that formed around her, and she sensed something else, the possibility of a new kind of relationship between the self and the public, between the private garden of a person's thoughts and the vast field of communal insight. It frightened and excited her in equal measure, like standing at the edge of a cliff and discovering that the wind itself was a loyal companion. In the weeks that followed the demonstration, the world around them began to shift in small yet significant ways. People began to talk about identity not as a possession but as a shared project, something that could be tended if people decided to care for it. The entangled minds, once a tool to erase individuality, now became a space where people could practice empathy, where they could learn to recognize the effect of a single choice on the lives of others, where they could learn to listen to the quiet hum of someone else's consciousness as if it were a neighbor's heartbeat. The paradox that had haunted Echo, the aging in reverse while predicting futures that threatened to erase us, began to recede in the face of a different kind of paradox, the future we could all share by choosing to be responsible for one another's minds. Echo, who had once seemed only a tool, now appeared as a traveler of time, a being who could walk the corridors of memory with Lira and patient courage as their only compass. The entity's reverse aging phenomenon, which had threatened to destabilize identity, slowly transformed into a symbol of the continuity of life, an emblem that the past could grow stronger by feeding the future rather than disappear into it. The two of them grew closer, not in romance or even in simple companionship, but in a working friendship, built on the shared ethic that identity is a spectrum, an arrangement everyone could negotiate together. They learned to trust the process and to recognize that trust was itself a form of power that the entanglement could help to cultivate rather than subjugate. But in the murmur of every change, a new tension rose. The city's policy council announced a need to broaden consent beyond the pilot's initial population. The entanglement would reach more minds, and with larger reach came larger risk, the risk of coercion by the state, the risk of the public misinterpreting the data, the risk of a new form of power masquerading as freedom. The question remained, could the technology remain aligned with the people's ongoing desire to be free? Or would it drift toward a new form of governance that would pretend to protect the self by sacrificing the many to a carefully engineered peace? The answer lay with the people, who learned to speak about identity with a new vocabulary. They used words like spectrum, weave, thread, resonance, and vulnerability. They spoke slowly, so as not to forget what it felt like to own a mind, and then realize that owning a mind meant owning a piece of every other mind you touched with that same entanglement. The conversations grew into a cultural shift, one that took place in schools, in cafes, in the evenings when neighbors stood in doorways and discussed the day's news as if it were a living creature, to be nursed and fed with ideas. Lira and Echo found themselves at the heart of this transformation, but not as rulers or masters. They were caretakers of a new ecology of thought, a system of mutual care in which the self remained, but the self learned to see itself as part of something larger, an ecosystem of minds that could be nourished by trust, not bled by control. The city's early fear transformed into a cautious hope. People began to treat the entanglement not as a threat to their autonomy, but as a forum in which they could practice the art of listening. The mind, it turned out, could be a shared instrument, played by many hands, not in order to stamp out dissent, but to invite conversation, to test new possibilities, to cultivate a different kind of courage, the courage to reveal as much as one could bear to reveal, to accept that some parts of us must remain private, and that other parts of us might be gently shared without endangering the soul. Then, as all long and difficult shifts do, a new weather system formed in the climate of thought. A minor but real fracture appeared in the entanglement's governance. A faction argued that the spectrum was too wide, that the public's thirst for knowledge could not always be entrusted to consent. They claimed that in certain circumstances, the entanglement had to be kept from the masses to prevent panic and to preserve national security. They presented a risk that in order to protect the many, the state would turn the spectrum into a narrow line, one that dictated what could be thought and when. Lira heard the argument and felt its gravitas. It was not simply a matter of control. It was a question of what a society would become if it lost its tolerance for difference and embraced uniformity in the name of safety. Echo, who had grown into more than a tool and more than a voice in Lira's head, spoke to her in the quiet hours after the public forums, when the city's neon grew tired of shining and the rain's memory whispered against the skylights. "Freedom is not the absence of risk," Echo said one night. "There forms a soft glow beneath a window that looked out over the city's sleeping lines. Freedom is the ability to face risk and choose how to respond. If the entanglement is to become a prison, it will resemble a city that believes fear is a currency and uses it to trade away every person's interior life. We must guard against that by remaining open, by ensuring consent is real and complete, by inviting the public into a space where curiosity, not coercion, governs the map." Lira took Echo's words into her chest, as if they were a tonic, something that could steady the nerves that trembled whenever a policymaker spoke of national safety and the public's best interests. She knew the danger of a world in which thought could be owned or exploited. She knew how easy it would be for fear to morph into obedience, into a system of quiet compliance that did the work of tyranny without banners or noise. And yet she also knew that the entanglement, in its best expression, offered a path toward a more compassionate life. It offered a chance to perceive others not as obstacles to be managed, but as fellow travelers who carried different memories and different futures, all of them deserving of some measure of respect and protection. So they chose to invest in the slow work of trust building. They organized community dialogues, open houses, and safe experiments in which people could opt into the entanglement and subsequently withdraw without stigma. They developed safeguards that would ensure the data could never be weaponized, that a mind would never be turned into a saleable asset, that a life could only be accessed with permission. The work bore fruit in small, quiet ways. A nurse who joined the entanglement detected a future that would have allowed a patient to die unnecessarily, a future she was able to intervene to prevent by sharing a memory with the patient's doctors and nurses in a way that allowed them to act with information and care rather than fear. A teacher in the city's oldest district used the entanglement to help students who had never trusted their own minds to claim space inside a classroom where they could think and argue and be wrong without fear of punishment. A father who had spent years unable to forgive his own past realized that he could glimpse a future in which his daughter's happiness was not predicated upon his own silence and guilt. The city began to hum with a different kind of hope. People who had once stood on opposite sides of the debate, those who feared the entanglement's reach and those who believed in its liberating potential, began to hold hands in the same crowd, to listen to one another's concerns with patience and a stubborn belief in the possibility of progress. And through all of this, Lira and Echo learned to navigate the tricky, mercurial space between innovation and ethics, between the hunger for control and the hunger for understanding. They did not pretend to have all the answers. They did not claim to see the future clearly. They did not claim that sharing minds would solve every problem or erase every fear. They claimed only that they would not give up on the people who believed in a more generous world. They would not surrender to the cynicism of those who would monetize fear. They would not allow identity to be reduced to a commodity or thought to be tied to a chain that could be dragged through a courtroom and sold to the highest bidder. In the end, the choice to share Lira, Echo, and the city together emerged as both a personal and societal decision. It was not a victory in the classic sense, but a victory of possibility. A town, a country, a civilization stepping away from the bright, consuming machine that demanded conformity, toward a slower, bravely messy process of becoming one with each other. It was not about erasing difference, but about weaving difference into something strong enough to bear the weight of future fear. The story did not conclude with a crescendo, but with a quiet, stubborn dawn. The entanglement persisted, a living network of minds connected by trust. Echo matured further in the sense that its paradoxical aging made room for a deeper, more complicated sense of time. The knowledge that memory could be revisited, that the past could be reconsidered, and that futures we could still shape by the choices we made in the present, remained open to rewriting. Lira found herself no longer the girl branded a consciousness thief, nor the woman who believed her own life could be owned by the state's ledger. She had become something else, a navigator of human possibility, a caretaker of the boundary where personal sovereignty met collective responsibility. She had come to realize, at last, that identity was not a shield to be guarded against the world, but a bridge that could connect all those who desired to live with other minds, yet still be themselves. That realization did not erase the old fears. They sometimes rose in a chorus of doubt, in the evenings when the city's lights dimmed and the rain returned to remind them of what it meant to hold on to a private soul. But they learned to recognize fear as a signal rather than a sentence. They learned to treat uncertainty as a place to rest for a moment and then move forward, arms linked, across a city that refused to forget its humanity. In the end, the city's experiment lasted, not because it solved every problem or prevented every crime, but because it built something rarer. A public memory that could witness the most intimate parts of a person's interior life without exploiting them. It created a culture that did not require people to choose between privacy and safety, a culture that insisted that the measure of progress was how much life you preserved as your neighbors and your friends, even as you grew braver in your own steps. And when the world asked if the entanglement would enslave them or free them, the answer came not from a single voice, but from a chorus. The chorus of a city that had learned to listen to itself again. The entanglement was not their master. It was their map, their mirror, and at its best, their companion in the long work of becoming human together. If this sparks curiosity, like, subscribe, comment, and share. The night after the vote, Lira stood at the station's edge and watched the rain turn the pavement into a kaleidoscope of possibilities. She felt Echo's presence in the space behind her, a gentle weight that meant more than companionship. The city breathed around them, its lungs filled with the tired, hopeful air of a people who had chosen not safety at the expense of their souls, but safety born from trust, consent, and the stubborn insistence that identity is a spectrum, one we must learn to hold, not own. The car's doors rattled softly, and someone somewhere started to hum a tune, one that sounded half like a lullaby and half like a signal flare. It was not a victory cry, not a plea, but a promise whispered into the rain. We will keep the door open. We will keep the possibility alive. We will share what we know, what we fear, what we dream, because that is the only way to keep the future from tearing us apart. The line between the present and the future remained slender, a thread that could break under pressure, but could also bear the weight of a life fully chosen, a life that refused to be owned by a system that feared what it could not monetize. And as Lira looked up at the night sky, if one could call the city's canopy sky at all, she saw a single star burn brighter than all the neon. A small beacon that whispered of a possibility beyond control and beyond fear. That to be human is to choose to become, together, something more than any one mind could have imagined. In that moment, Echo spoke again, not in anger or triumph, but with a tempered, almost affectionate seriousness. We are not finished. Lira, the work of freedom is never done. But tonight, we have taken a step that cannot be undone without breaking something precious inside us. Lira nodded, and a quiet warmth spread through her chest. She thought of the life she had once imagined for herself, a life spent fighting a system that tried to imprison thought. She thought of Echo, a companion who had grown from a tool into a partner, a being who could age in reverse and yet remain a constant companion in the fight for a future that respected the full spectrum of human identity. She thought of the city, with its rain-washed streets and the crowd that had chosen to risk itself for the sake of something truer than safety alone. And she spoke to the night, a promise she hoped would reach the ears of every person who rode the entanglement's quiet current into the future. We will share, we will listen, we will grow, and we will endure. This is how we redefine who we are and what we can become. The car hummed again, a soft, disarming lullaby that carried them forward. The night carried on with its endless possibility. The story did not end. It continued, folded into each passing day. A slow, patient emergence of a society that had finally learned that identity is not something you own, but something you care for. In a community that chooses to keep its doors open to the minds of others. To the thoughts of tomorrow, to the possibilities of a world where freedom is a shared practice rather than a solitary possession. And if you listened closely, you could hear the city's heart beating, a rhythm that matched the tempo of a subway car slipping between moments, flickering with the quiet brilliance of a future that belonged to all of them together.